Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. The mace head tells us quite a bit. First, there's the fact that it's a mace head, a symbol of domination which, unlike an axe, really only has one purpose: cracking the skulls of one's enemies. So we've entered a period marked by violent conflict. Second is the imagery, the lion-headed eagle of Ningirsu. The deity, whose name means Lord of Girsu, was a god of agriculture and healing. But, in line with the times, he was now also a god of war. Third was the macehead setting, a shrine dedicated to Ningirsu in his city of Girsu, which, together with the cities of Lagash and Nina, made up the Sumerian city-state of Lagash. Lastly, there's the text, which records that Mesilim, king of Kish, builder of the temple of Ningirsu, brought this macehead for Ningirsu, Lugal Shah Engur being ruler of Lagash. The fact that a macehead of a king of Kish was placed in a shrine in Lagash, a shrine which he'd apparently constructed, tells us something else: that the kings of Kish exercised a special authority throughout Mesopotamia. The Sumerian king list bears this out, describing how, after the flood had swept over the land and kingship descended from heaven a second time, Kish became the seat of kingship. It also records that, in a case of extremely precise Sumerian accounting, the 23 kings of Kish's first dynasty ruled Mesopotamia for the next, quote, 24,510 years, 3 months, and 3.5 days. We're probably safe in rounding that down a slight bit. The macehead dates to roughly 2550 BC and bears one of the oldest known Sumerian royal inscriptions. It's possible the Stele of Ushumgal from the nearby city of Umma may record the name of an earlier king of Kish named Aga, characterized in a later poem as an implacable foe of King Gilgamesh. A few centuries prior, Gilgamesh's own home city of Uruk had also produced the Warka vase, one of the earliest surviving works of narrative sculpture, contemporary with, and of similar importance to, the Palette of Narmer in Egypt. But again, in terms of written sources for historical events, the macehead's the top of the list. So let's get back to the story. From his own words, we know that King Mesilim of Kish donated the macehead to the shrine of Ningirsu in Lagash, a city-state overseen by a ruler named Lugal Shah Engur. And as it happens, we actually know why he did this. According to a later inscription, Mesilim had come south to demarcate the border between Ningirsu and Shara by planting a boundary stone. Ningirsu, as I mentioned, was god of Lagash, while Shara was the god of neighboring Umma. So, long story short, Mesilim had used his special authority as king of Kish to settle a boundary dispute. By the early 3rd millennium BC, the growing cities of Mesopotamia and the villages, fields, and canals they relied on for sustenance were starting to encroach on one another. Competing claims over land and resources could sometimes be resolved diplomatically, through gifts, alliances, compromises, etc. In other cases, cities decided to organize armies and settle the matter through war. The warriors, of course, were the same individuals who worked the fields and maintained the canals, and there was certainly nothing like formal military training. It was more put down your shovel, pick up that spear, and basically hope for the best. Numbers were obviously a pretty big factor, as was some suitable motivation, at least for the attacking party. For a city inclined toward priestly rule, it might be as simple as expressing that war was the will of the local god. For a city governed by a citizens' assembly, the dynamics were likely a bit different. Either way, what you really wanted was a strong, experienced, and talented individual to act as a temporary war leader. Someone to craft a good plan, motivate the troops, and lead them to military victory. A big man, if you will, which, unsurprisingly, is exactly what they were called. The Sumerian term for big man was Lugal. Others were called En, Lord, or NC, Lord of the Plowland. At this early stage, they all pretty much meant the same thing. The role was conceptually very similar to the Roman office of dictator. And just like that role, things sometimes got out of hand. Victorious Lugals claimed divine favor, and in the early years of the third millennium, gained the ability to stay in power between military conflicts, then to pass down rule to their sons. Sumerian literature marked this change as when kingship descended from heaven. It's also known as the Early Dynastic Period. These early kings were created for war, and if you'd like a visual of contemporary warfare, the Sumerians are happy to oblige. The so-called war side of the Standard of Ur shows that kings or officers rode in war wagons pulled by donkeys or onagers. Horses, as I mentioned, were still virtually unknown in Mesopotamia. Soldiers were outfitted with leather or metal helmets and leather cloaks studded with metal discs. They also apparently fought barefoot. Most troops carried spears, while others used bows. In close combat, soldiers wielded metal axes, daggers, and stone maces. Numbers are always hard to nail down, but large city-states could likely field armies well into the upper thousands. While the battles were likely horrifically violent, contemporary records note mounds of corpses, there were some rules of engagement. Captured soldiers could be taken as slaves, but non-combatants and civic infrastructure were frequently left unmolested. Temples were usually off-limits. It's worth mentioning that, to the Sumerians, there was no such thing as a false god. All gods were real, though some might be stronger than others, and it was never a good idea to incur their wrath. The goals of warfare were also constrained, typically gaining control over disputed land or resources, imposing tribute, or forcing a city to commit its army to fight in joint operations. The goal was seldom outright destruction or even direct annexation. As far as we can tell, even a city's most hated rival had an implicit right to both existence and, to a surprising degree, independence, which is pretty laudable and seems to have lasted all the way down to the advent of Lugal Zagai, on whom more later. The emergence of kings and endemic warfare brought two new architectural forms: royal palaces and city walls. Palaces were usually built near temples, to associate rulers with the city's main god, while the breadth and height of defensive walls reflected a city's power. In the famous epic, the hero King Gilgamesh directs his companion Ur-Shanabi to marvel at his handiwork. This is the wall of Uruk, which no city on earth can equal. See how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. In tandem with the role of king came a related concept, that of preeminent kingship over all of Mesopotamia. Per Mark van de Meerup, the semi-mythical Sumerian king list relates how kingship was passed on from city to city, whose local dynasties held temporary hegemony over the entire region. While it's unlikely that any city ever really held this kind of authority, it likely refers to dominant cities during various historical periods. The most obvious symbol of this early dominance was control of the city of Nippur, and in particular of its Ekur temple. The temple was dedicated to Enlil, Lord Wind or Lord of Storms, who'd recently eclipsed the sky god An as the chief Sumerian deity. One city often assigned such preeminent authority was Kish, to the extent that later kings, wherever they were from, proclaimed themselves to be king of Kish after achieving regional dominance. The central Mesopotamian city of Kish was located around 60 miles south of modern Baghdad. It was close enough to Sumer to share a common culture, but distant enough to allow for some degree of ethnic and linguistic variation. Along with Sumerian, the Kishites spoke a Semitic language related to others in use in the broader region. I'd call it Akkadian, but that's premature, since we haven't really found it Akkad. Per the Sumerian king list, the first dynasty of Kish was started by a king named Eannatum. Eannatum was followed by 7 more rulers, several of whom had Semitic names, before we arrive at Enmebaragesi. And we can hang our hat on Enmebaragesi because not only is he mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but we also have an actual contemporary inscription bearing his name. King list, Gilgamesh, and archaeology. It's a dawn of civilization trifecta. It also happens to bolster the claim that Gilgamesh may be an actual historical figure. No sooner do we start getting multiple sources than those sources start to conflict. The king list says that after Enmebaragesi, Kish was defeated in battle and its kingship was carried off to Uruk. But another source, the Tumal inscription, inserts some connective tissue. It appears that Enmebaragesi was actually followed by his son, King Aga of Kish, who's mentioned in multiple sources. Then Aga was defeated not by Uruk, but by Ur, under its dynastic founder, Mesanipada, who passed down rule to his son, Meskayaghnuna, before the latter was defeated by King Gilgamesh. I'll post some materials to help you keep this all straight. Before leaving Ur, we should also mention that this is the era of the royal cemetery, where royal figures were found entombed along with staggering wealth and dozens of murdered attendants. Like the similar practice in Egypt, which I covered last episode, human sacrifices at royal tombs quickly fell out of favor. I mean, among the royals. The attendants were never big fans. I'll dig into the royal cemetery a bit more in one of my Patreon mini-episodes. As for Gilgamesh's home city of Uruk, the king list traces its royal line from Meskaya Gasher, the founder of Uruk and son of the sun god Utu. The next few names get a bit more familiar, at least from Sumerian sources. Lugalbanda, the first king to become a god, Dumuzi, who married the goddess Inanna, then, finally, Gilgamesh himself. Through his role in numerous poems and epics, Gilgamesh became the premier superhero of the ancient world, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. In the words of his poet, Gilgamesh was the king who saw the deep, the foundations of the land. He knew everything, was wise in all matters. The king who came a far road, was weary, found peace, and set all his labors on a tablet of stone. You should all really read the epic sometime. It's a pretty fantastic work. The events and figures we've discussed so far, to the extent they actually existed, were confined to the first half of the 3rd millennium BC. Per Samuel Noah Kramer, starting around 2500, we have several hundred dedicatory inscriptions that enable us to reconstruct a more or less unbroken history of the region, at least as far as the major figures and events are concerned. These early inscriptions derive primarily from the southern city-state of Lagash. And, as the Macehead intro may have foreshadowed, a common thread throughout the inscriptions is Lagash's conflict with neighboring Umma over some fertile fields called the Gu Edena, or Edge of the Plains. Lagash's first dynasty was founded by a king named Urnanshi. The king is shown in a famous relief, bald, clean-shaven, barefoot, and wearing only a woolen skirt. In one scene, he carries a basket of bricks on his head while accompanied by 7 of his sons. He was most definitely a builder. Inscriptions record his construction of numerous temples, statues, and canals, as well as the city's defensive walls. He also boasts several times that he had ships of Dilmun submit timber to Lagash as tribute. Okay, everyone, it's unpacking time, so please find a comfortable chair. In the first episode of this series, I mentioned that Dilmun, essentially modern Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, was cast in the role of a paradise land in early Sumerian poems. It also may have been the original Sumerian homeland. So while it may sound a bit odd that a Sumerian ruler could impose tribute on a Persian Gulf kingdom, it's maybe not so crazy if the two regions had long-standing cultural, political, or economic ties. It's also worth noting that Dilmun had no native timber. In fact, the closest likely source was along the west coast of India. So the full unpack goes like this. As far back as 2500 BC, Dilmun was already a nexus of trade between Sumer and the Indus Valley civilization, with goods like timber, copper, ivory, and tin going one way, and textiles, foodstuffs, and possibly silver traveling the other. Because it's only if such trade was already established that Urnanshi could push for a cut. But soon enough, it's back to the fields and back to the war against Umma, who this time was allied with the city of Ur. Urnanshi notes his success against both and his capture of both enemy kings, which may have quieted things down for a bit. But under Urnanshi's son, Akur-Gal, it was right back to business as usual. According to an inscription, during Akur-Gal's reign, Ush, ruler of Umma, acted arrogantly. He smashed Mesilim's monument and marched onto the plain of Lagash, which he then renamed and occupied. During the remainder of his reign, Akur-Gal was unable or unwilling to take back his fields from the Ummaites. Which brings us to 2450 BC and the reign of Akur-Gal's son, Eannatum of Lagash, about whom there is a great deal to say. Let's start with his origin story. Eannatum relates that he was fathered by Ningirsu, nursed by the mother goddess Ninhursag, given a fine name by Inanna, and granted wisdom by Enki, which is quite a lot of godly attention, so the pressure to perform was clearly on. Job 1 was reclaiming captured land from the Ummaites. After a battle in which he was pierced by an arrow, Eannatum records that he defeated Umma and made 20 burial mounds for it. He restored to Ningirsu's control his beloved field, the Gu Edena. Somewhat surprisingly, the victorious Eannatum didn't destroy the sacrilegious, trespassing, monument-smashing city of Umma. He didn't even seize their part of the fields, or, as he puts it, he did not cross beyond the place where Mesilim had erected his monument. In fact, he didn't even kick them out of his part of the fields. Instead, Eannatum records that he left a kilometer-long strip of Ningirsu's land under Umma's control, on the condition that they give him a cut of the resulting proceeds, which sounds like pretty reasonable treatment for a despised and prostrate enemy. To commemorate his victory, Eannatum erected the famous Stele of the Vultures. The stele is a mixture of images and text running across the front and back. Surviving fragments of the front show Eannatum leading his troops in a tightly packed phalanx formation. So someone's been doing some military training. They also show a burial mound of defeated enemies, with vultures carrying off some of their heads, hence the stele's name. The back is dominated by the massive figure of the god Ningirsu, bearing a mace and hoisting captured enemies in a battle net, which is what's depicted in the amazing art for this episode created by my friend Mike Oeming. Gerald S. Cooper proposes that there were actually 2 battles against Umma, one shortly after Eannatum came to power and a second near the end of his reign, with the stele being commissioned after the latter. As a consequence, the stele's inscriptions also document a number of campaigns in between. In one, Eannatum records his victory over Elam and Subartu, mountainous lands of timber and treasure. Other inscriptions reinforce that he defeated Elam, the amazing mountain, and made burial mounds for it, and that he drove the Elamite back to his own land. Which actually kinda sorta makes sense. So before going further, allow me to give you a very brief history of the neighboring kingdom of Elam, which I'll do right after this short break.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
You don't need to use an oversized AI model for everything, just like you don't need to use an axe to slice a cake. Find out how smaller models can deliver the right results and help cut AI costs up to 90% at IBM.com. The AI built for business. IBM. Looking for an AI glow-up that passes the office vibe check? What? AI that only knows the internet doesn't make sense for business. Get AI trained on your data at IBM.com. The AI built for business. IBM.
The major Elamite city of Susa was only 200 miles from Lagash, not too much farther than Lagash was to Kish. But that proximity hides a world of cultural difference. While Sumer relied on the Tigris and Euphrates, the lowlands around Susa, known as Susiana or Khuzestan, mainly relied on rivers and streams descending from the Zagros Mountains. Elamite culture looked toward the mountains, and the kingdom extended from Susa eastward toward the major city of Anshan in the Iranian highlands, in the region later known as Fars or Persis. In the much later Achaemenid Persian period, Susa had become a royal city under Darius I, while Anshan would precede Pasargadae and Persepolis as capital of the Persians. Between the Mesopotamian plain and Iranian highlands lay countless riverine valleys. Some provided a suitable environment for agricultural villages and towns, while others were more suitable for pastoralists and roaming herds. Neighboring valleys could also be at different elevations, which was great for growing a variety of crops. Large-scale settlement was only possible in sizable intermountain plains. As a result, urban centers in the Zagros Mountains were sparse and widely distributed. Across this highly varied topography, the Elamites developed their own distinct culture alongside Mesopotamia. Not that the Mesopotamians would leave them alone, because the Zagros Mountains and the Persian plateau just off to the east held a wealth of valuable resources. So if you find yourself wondering why later Mesopotamian kings, like Naram-Sin of Akkad or Shulgi of Ur, keep launching campaigns into the Zagros Mountains, it's actually kinda straightforward. I should also mention that Elam is a Sumerian term. The Elamites called their own land Awan. Let's return our attention to lowland Susa. Per Roger Matthews and Hassan Faseli Nashli, Susa was founded in the mid-5th millennium BC and quickly became the major lowland political and religious center. The clearest evidence is the construction of a monumental mud brick platform, rising in a series of steps up to perhaps 20 meters above the plain. Inlaid ceramic cones and clay models of goat horns were set in groups into the face of the upper stage of the platform, which was very likely topped by cultic buildings. During the mid-4th millennium BC, Susa encountered the Uruk expansion. The Sumerian colony established in the region was intended to access highland resources, mainly stone, timber, and metal, especially copper. The Sumerians also imported the worship of Inanna, the Semitic Ishtar, whom the Elamites associated with their goddess Inshushinak. It's likely in this era that Susa, or Shush, took its name from the goddess. While they chose to adopt some useful innovations, the Elamites may have viewed the expansion as unwanted cultural imposition. They were also probably less than thrilled with the highland resource extraction. One possible sign of local reaction was in how they wrote things down. The Elamites had their own distinct language, one with no known relations, and it was first inscribed during the Uruk expansion using the Sumerian cuneiform script. But once the Sumerians pulled up stakes, the Elamites started using a new native script called Proto-Elamite. The Elamites also showed their hostility in much less ambiguous ways. The closest Sumerian city was Lagash, and the Elamites frequently attacked the city, including the incursion repelled by King Eannatum. Circling back to his reign, in addition to his defeats of Umma and Elam, inscriptions record Eannatum's victories over Ur, Uruk, and Akshak. Akshak was a powerful central Mesopotamian city near Kish, and Eannatum relates that he crushed Zuzu, king of Akshak, all the way from Girsu to Akshak and killed him. In the wake of this victory, Eannatum took the title King of Kish to signal his regional dominance. This was Lagash at the height of its power. At the time, it was also the world's largest city, with a population approaching 50,000. The remainder of Eannatum's reign saw two major events. His second final victory over Umma, the one recorded on the Stele of the Vultures, and his battle against a triple alliance of Kish, Akshak, and Mari. For that one, we need to take a side trip up the Euphrates to cover the city of Mari. Northern Mesopotamia and Syria had been urbanized for roughly as long as Sumer. We previously touched on the ancient sites of Tepe Gawra on the upper Tigris and Arslan Tepe on the upper Euphrates, the later Iron Age Malatya. There were also Ugarit and Byblos on the Syrian coast, and Tel Brak on the Kabur River, later capital of the Hurrian kingdom of Nagar. While the south relied on the Tigris and Euphrates, the north was more reliant on rainfall, and the lower agricultural yields had several impacts. First, in contrast to Sumer, Syrian cities tended to be smaller and surrounded by much larger areas of farmland, which alternated as grazing land for herds of nomadic pastoralists. Lower yields also diminished the role, and consequently the power, of northern priests. And from early on, the palace, not the temple, was the font of urban authority. A related outcome was a focus on trade as a major economic driver. While many northern cities followed this pattern, the regional powerhouses were unquestionably Mari and Ebla. Mari was founded around 2900 BC, possibly by an early king of Kish to help manage the flow of northern goods headed south toward Mesopotamia. The city was sited near the Euphrates, but far enough away to avoid its floods, connected by an artificial canal some 5 miles long. As a planned city with a built-in purpose, Mari's population grew quickly. Excavations reveal that the city featured a defensive circular internal rampart roughly 20 feet thick and 30 feet high, reinforced by defensive towers. Though Mari did have a central mound, it didn't hold a palace or a temple. Only a monumental building nearly 100 feet long and 75 feet wide that served some administrative function. The newly planted city had one major problem. Even farther upriver and off to the west was the much older city of Ebla. Per Trevor Bryce, Ebla was the most politically and commercially powerful kingdom of northern Syria in the early Bronze Age. Its importance derived from its role as hub of a sprawling trade network, with links to the Syrian coast, central Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and regions further to the east. As you might expect, Ebla had some strong opinions about this major new commercial entrepot interposed between them and the wealthy and populous cities of Mesopotamia, which in the early dynastic period typically translated to war. Apart from periodic conflict with Ebla, Mari's history over the next few centuries is only scantily known, other than a brief, mysterious abandonment around 2550 BC. The people who soon repopulated Mari built the city's first palace and temple, to Itur-Mer, the god of oaths. They also likely founded Mari's first independent dynasty. Luckily for us, archives from Ebla give plenty of details on events of the subsequent period. The primary source is a letter from a Mariote king named Enadagan to an Eblaite king named Irkab-Damu, recounting the deeds of Enadagan's ancestors. The earliest Mariote king mentioned, likely from around 2500 BC, was said to have attacked the Eblaite kingdom and conquered many of its cities. The middle of the century saw a reversal, with an Eblaite victory over Mari. But Mari quickly regained its footing, and its next king conquered the city of Emar, an important Eblaite outpost along the Euphrates. This is roughly the time when the current Mariote king, likely a figure named Ishtup-Ishar, was invited by the king of Kish and the king of Akshak to join an attack on Lagash. It's not clear what the motivation was, except for Akshak, who probably wanted revenge. One thing I'll mention is that Kish and Mari, along with Ebla, despite the hostility, were all closely integrated in terms of language, culture, trade, and diplomacy. Per Amanda H. Podany, the Semitic languages spoken in each city were probably mutually intelligible. They used the same weights and measures, the same calendars, and worshipped many of the same gods. Perhaps most importantly, they all used the same cuneiform writing system adopted from southern Mesopotamia. In fact, one of the world's earliest dictionaries was created to translate Sumerian words into Eblaite. Going by contemporary statues and reliefs, even fashions and hairstyles were similar. Men wore long kilts made of a tasseled fabric, while women donned floor-length tunics of the same material, leaving one shoulder exposed. Kings wore their hair long, parted in the middle, and tied up in the back in a complicated bun-like knot. They also wore a braided headband, which basically served as a crown. If you'd like a visual, you can basically look at my podcast logo. Whatever Kish and Mari's motivations, they decided to ally with Akshak. Combined armies marched south and confronted King Eannatum on his northern border. And then something happened. If you believe Eannatum, it's pretty straightforward. He defeated Kish, Akshak, and Mari. Bing, bang, boom. But subsequent developments don't necessarily bear that out. Whether defeat, stalemate, or Pyrrhic victory, the battle's aftermath saw a steep decline in the power and influence of Lagash. Eannatum was soon succeeded by his brother Eannatum, whose own reign was entirely focused on the border conflict with Umma. No more bestriding Sumer like a colossus, no more Stele, no more king of Kish. And insult to injury, Lagash soon lost the title of world's largest city, not to Kish or Akshak, but to Mari. Mari's first golden age kicked into gear at the dawn of the 24th century. Its new king, Iblul-Il, started things off relatively pro forma by attacking the kingdom of Ebla. He eventually conquered so many of its cities that his Eblaite contemporary Igrish-Halam was forced to pay tribute to Mari. Iblul-Il then proceeded to campaign as far as the Middle Euphrates, and even some distance south along the Tigris. By the end of his reign, Mari was clearly the dominant power in northern Syria. The king celebrated his many victories by erecting statues of himself in several of his city's temples. Iblul-Il was briefly succeeded by a king called Nizi, then by King Enadagan. In Ebla, the new king was Irkab-Damu, son of the disgraced king Igrish-Halam, who'd given the Mariotes tribute. To make sure the tribute continued to flow, and remind Irkab-Damu of his proper place, Enadagan of Mari sent him the letter we mentioned earlier, the one recounting his ancestors' victories, particularly those over Ebla. Irkab-Damu was not impressed, and launched a fresh war against Mari. The end result was that Mari's gains of the last few decades were almost completely erased. Enadagan was forced to agree to some sort of treaty that ended the conflict, though he was apparently spared the reverse humiliation of having to pay tribute to Ebla. It's worth noting that letters from King Irkab-Damu of Ebla include both the earliest known diplomatic letter to the powerful king of Hamazi in the Zagros foothills, and the earliest known bilateral treaty with the subordinate king of nearby Abarsal. As Podani highlights, their formulaic style suggests that diplomacy was already a well-honed art by the time these letters were written. They just happen to be the oldest surviving examples. The treaty with Abarsal covers a broad set of topics, from trade to mutual defense to the proper treatment of messengers and merchants to fines for various transgressions, including murder. Such treaties were always sworn by the gods and invoked disastrous consequences for any violation. It was just such a treaty that ended the conflict between Irkab-Damu of Ebla and Enadagan of Mari. The final blow to the Mariote dynasty came under Enadagan's successor, King Haidar. During his reign, an Eblaite vizier named Ibbi-Sipish, granted vast authority by the new Eblaite king, formed a military alliance with Kish and the Hurrian city of Nagar. According to Podani, Ibbi-Sipish sealed the alliance by sending thousands of bronze spearheads to both cities. In the mid-24th century BC, the Triple Alliance defeated the Mariotes at Turka, some distance north of Mari. And just like the earlier case with Lagash, the battle's aftermath saw a steep decline in the power and influence of Mari, though events from the south would soon overtake both cities. For the rest of this episode, let's catch up on events back down in Lagash. During the reign of Eannatum's successor and brother Eannatum, the city of Umma remained a royal pain, refusing to pay its cut of the barley, diverting water channels, smashing monuments, you name it. Their king, Umma, even went so far as destroying some chapels to Ningirsu, Ninhursag, Enlil, and Utu that Eannatum had built on a boundary levee, which for Sumerians was kind of the ultimate crime. Umma then hired people of foreign lands as mercenaries and marched on Lagash from the north. Inscriptions record that King Eannatum fought with Umma in the field of the god Ningirsu. They also record that it was Enmetana, beloved son of Eannatum, who defeated Umma. The victorious prince Enmetana soon succeeded his father as king of Lagash. Umma of Umma was succeeded by his nephew, a former temple administrator named Il, or as Enmetana calls him, Il the field thief, who speaks evil. Il was just as hostile to Lagash as his uncle Umma had been. The new king threatened to divert some canals, but Enmetana managed to dissuade him. Through war or diplomacy isn't really clear. Once things calmed down, Enmetana decided to try his luck at something new, extending Lagash's holdings southwestward toward Uruk. He met with some initial success. Inscriptions record Enmetana using conscripts from Uruk to build a local temple. But at some point, Enmetana faced some serious pushback from King Lugal Kinshi Dudu of Uruk. I know, it's a pretty funny name. Inscriptions record that the latter was not only king of Uruk, but also of Ur, and also had the regional juice to call himself king of Kish. The result was peace, or possibly an alliance, and a text records that at that time, Enmetana, ruler of Lagash, and Lugal Kinshi Dudu, ruler of Uruk, established brotherhood. After ruling Lagash for 19 years, Enmetana was succeeded by his son, Eannatum II, who was apparently killed around 3 years later in another Elamite raid. At this point, the throne of Lagash was usurped by a former high priest of Ningirsu named Enentarzi. Enentarzi then ruled for 6 years before being succeeded by his son, Lugalanda. According to ancient texts, Lugalanda's own 6-year reign was a masterclass in corruption, confiscating lands, overtaxing citizens, appointing cronies to positions of power, corrupting the priesthood, and misusing properties for his own personal gain. Which was all pretty odious, but it did set the stage for his semi-famous successor, King Urukagina of Lagash. The events around Urukagina's rise are unclear. Lugalanda may have been killed or simply died, or Urukagina may have usurped his throne. What is clear is what happened next. The new king promulgated a set of social and ethical reforms that are often cited as the earliest example of a legal code in recorded history. It's basically making the leap from a treaty stipulating how two rulers should act toward each other to addressing how members of one's own society should act toward each other, including the king himself. The code starts by noting ongoing abuses, including overtaxation, price gouging, forced labor, forced forfeitures of lands and goods, and, quote, temple administrators ripping out the orchards of the poor. It then relates how Urukagina ended these practices by, quote, restoring the customs of former times. He also refers to a binding oral agreement with the god Ningirsu that he would never subjugate the orphan or widow to the powerful. The code also includes the earliest appearance of the word freedom the Sumerian Amagi, in all of recorded history, which is pretty amazing, but also a bit ironic given what's coming down the tracks. Over in Umma, King Eel the Field Thief was succeeded by a short-reigning son-in-law named Gishakidu, then by a figure named Bubu. We don't know much about King Bubu, other than his name is pretty hilarious, and that he was the Luma priest of Nisaba, the Mesopotamian goddess of writing. He may have been Gishakidu's son, or not. We don't really know how long he ruled. We can maybe assume that he devoted his reign to building up Umma's armed forces. If so, that'd help explain the reign of his son, another Luma priest of Nisaba who took the name of King Who Fills the Treasury, or in Sumerian, Lugal-Zagesi. In the 2360s BC, Lugal-Zagesi embarked on an entirely novel undertaking, the complete conquest of all of Mesopotamia. Being a king of Umma, one of his early targets was longtime enemy Lagash, currently ruled by the OG lawgiver Urukagina. And here's something interesting transpired. In addition to his legal reforms, Urukagina also boasted of building the Wall of Girsu, one of the three main cities that made up Lagash. As a consequence, while Lugal-Zagesi seized most of Lagash, he was apparently unable to take the newly fortified city of Girsu. Or maybe he had other priorities. Either way, in a poignant twist, it meant that Urukagina remained alive to document the conquest of his kingdom. He records that the leader of Umma set fire to the Ekir Bira. He set fire to the Antasur and bundled off its precious metals in lapis lazuli. The text continues in a similar vein, listing over a dozen Lagash temples as being plundered, with several also destroyed. In the fields of Ningirsu, whichever were cultivated, he destroyed the barley. The leader of Umma, having sacked Lagash, has committed a sin against the god Ningirsu. May Nisaba, the god of Lugal-Zagesi, ruler of Umma, make the people of Umma bear this sin on their necks. Lugal-Zagesi also documented his own conquests, and I hope it isn't too much of a shock that their texts read a little bit differently. Lugal-Zagesi starts things off by announcing himself as King of Uruk and King of the land. So Uruk was clearly another early and important conquest. He continues that Enlil, king of all the lands, put all the lands at Lugal-Zagesi's feet, and from east to west made them subject to him. From the lower sea, along the Tigris and Euphrates, to the upper sea, Enlil put their roads in good order for him. From east to west, Enlil permitted him no rival. So basically claiming rulership of all lands from the Mediterranean down to the Persian Gulf. He then leaps right over the messy conquests to get to the happy ending. Under Lugal-Zagesi, the lands rested contentedly. The people made merry. Uruk spent its time rejoicing. Ur, like a bull, raised high its head. Larsa, the beloved city of the god Utu, made merry, and Umma, the beloved city of Shara, lifted its huge horns. I mean, I'm not sure what Urukagina was going on about. This guy sounds pretty amazing. Sometime during Lugal-Zagesi's reign, the city of Ebla was destroyed, which is actually kind of awesome for us, since the burning of the palace baked the clay tablets that preserved a lot of the history we covered earlier. But otherwise, not so great for the Ebleites. While the responsibility may lie with the briefly resurgent Mari, the more likely culprit was Lugal-Zagesi. If so, it bears out his claim to have conquered right up to the Mediterranean. The sweeping triumphs of his early years paved the way for a reign of several decades, though it's unlikely that reign was as peaceful and secure as the king might have you believe. In the same inscription where he notes his victories, Lugal-Zaggisi seems acutely aware of his newly forged empire's fragility. He pleads that, "May the favorable destiny which An and Enlil have determined never alter for me. May I forever be a proud shepherd." He also requests that the nipples of heaven function properly under me. Which, sure, we all want that. We'll leave things there for this supersized episode on the Early Dynastic Period. Next episode, it's back to Egypt and the glories of the Old Kingdom. We'll see how, in stark contrast to Sumerian infighting, the Egyptians pooled their considerable resources to build some amazing monuments. Pyramids, of course, but also sun temples. Though not without a few challenges and bumps in the road. Next time on The Ancient World. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World Podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.